so last week was the introduction to product management. We covered a lot of the strategy project concepts. This week we'll get into more of the tactics. Before we get started with this week's, any questions from last week? Topics? Any items that you're curious about? All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. So the focus today is going to be after these strategy things that we covered. So remember last week, the adaptive product model, what we discussed there was if you're in a B2B world or a B2C world, and then your digital experience, how much of what you sell as a product or service is digital versus how much of it is human or perhaps physical. So that was the quadrant. We talked about the role of the product manager versus the owner. The product manager is a full-time job. The owner is a role in Scrum. So the product manager, we want that person to think like the CEO of the company, of their business unit, understand their competitors. The foundation, that was the overall approach for if you are running a product management team, what are the disciplines you need? So the team structure, the operating cadence, the ways of working. And then we also briefly described those foundational elements before getting into discovery and delivery. And on the 10 strategy principles, these are just business principles. We talked about concepts such as the technology adoption curve, first mover advantages, or unique competitive, what's so compelling and differentiating that others can't compete on. And then we briefly covered the strategy frameworks. We actually might have skipped the meta strategy frameworks. This would have been the business model canvas. So I don't think we covered that, but that is in the slide deck. The business model canvas is a good way just to explain your business model to others. It calls out what are your key differentiating factors and what is very hard to copy, and then your overall cost structure and revenue model all on a single page. It was meant to replace a 30-page business plan. You'll see that in the slides. Discovery, what we covered there was opportunity and solution trees, identifying the right opportunities, the right solutions. And then lastly, empowered product teams. That's Marty Kagan's framework, where you're trying to really mitigate 4 kinds of risks. Will people buy it? Can people use it? Can we build it? And will it fit within our business model? So that's all some of the strategy concepts that you need to have when you run your product management team. These next really are 3. What we're going to cover today is how you design from the outside in. And we'll touch on 3 concepts and we'll tie them all together: jobs theory, personas, and journey mapping. So before we get started with any of those, are any of you using jobs theory today by show of hands? Or have even heard of that term?
None.
No, none. All right. How many of you are using personas today? All right. I see 1, 2, 3. Good.
Eric, David, Chris, good.
And then how many of you are using journey maps? All right. None are using journny maps.
We do actually event storming, which is kind of.
Yeah.
It is.
Very good. And that's actually a good tee up, because these concepts are helpful if you ever want to do event storming in the future. We find event storming a lot easier to do if you understand some of these concepts. Before we jump in, for those of you that said you're using personas, can you describe how you're using them? Yep, jobs theory is jobs to be done. Yes. Yeah, Chris, tell us a little bit more about that. How you're using that?
Yeah. So we'll have some of these personas, and we use those personas because we'll use like user stories as opposed to, I guess, the jobs to be done. I never heard jobs to be done uses jobs theory, but I'm familiar with jobs to be done. But we use personas to kind of like, as a persona, I want to do something so that, they can achieve some goal or something out of that type of framework.
Good. And do you have any more details besides that persona, or is it just a title?
It'll kind of go through a little bit of like their background, who they are. Like in our situations, it could be, are they someone diagnosed with a condition? Are they caring for someone with a condition? And it could go into more details in terms of like particulars into that, so they have more. Or it could take the aspect of, since some of the stuff's internal, it could be the aspect of like another developer using an internal API that somebody else is writing for them. So this way, my engineers get used to writing the stories since there's such a small team. They kind of have to do
Yep.
some of it. I don't have a dedicated like person writing the stories. I guess the product owner, right? If I had a full team, I guess I would be the product owner helping write the stories. I don't necessarily have that all the time, so I have been going through the practice of writing them as well. So we have personas even for some of the different internal people that might consume some of the stuff that we're trying to work on for each other. Because like say the data scientists are using the APIs or the models that are being created by my NLP engineers. So we'll have personas mapped out specifically for those types of individuals to help as well.
Yep, very good. And then I think, David, did you raise your hand for personas?
Yeah, I did, but it's been a long time. It goes back to Scrum days and initially defining how many story points would be in a project. We use personas for that. And also that would go into the job identification, jobs to be done.
Very good. All right. Have any of you read any of the books about jobs to be done or jobs theory or studied that at all? I'm taking a no show of hands. All right. Well,
Sorry.
we'll
I mean, I didn't read any books specifically on it, but I've done a lot of like internet research on it that way, but no like formal like book or something like that. I'd say I went through with
good.
jobs.
Well, you're going to get about the same level of education here on that about your research. So we're going to be cursory level, but we'll point you to, if you want to learn more about it, what some of those concepts are. So just at a high level, the idea here is you're trying to design your product or solution from the outside in, from the customer or the market, versus engineers trying to create just a solution that solves a particular problem. You're really trying to understand the future buyer and who's willing to pay you money for that next purchase and ongoing. So that's the approach there. So looking at these, jobs theory is really why the person needs your product or service. And we'll show you the examples of what these are here. And you're going to see this analogy of, a shovel versus a hole versus a fence, and we'll explain that. Persona is understanding who is buying your product. So in this case, for a shovel, is it the farmer? Is it the plumber? Is it, for example, some other electrician or other construction worker? And then the relationship journey analysis is how is your customer interacting with humans and technologies through some relationship, typically a buying experience, a shopping experience, or a long-term relationship. And so that's what we mean by a journey. So you might, for example, start out on the web, or you might get a physical mail as an outbound. You may hit the web, you may call, you may pay with credit card or cash, and you may get delivery, or you may go pick up something yourself. So that's the idea of a journey. These are multiple steps over time. And that's where it can be somewhat helpful in the concept of event storming, but also jobs to be done can be helpful with event storming also. So those are kind of at a high level, the three different tools and where you might use them. And we'll address this again, but different ways to use these different approaches. And we'll just go into the fundamentals of each one, because you're probably going to use some of these in the next 5 years somewhere in your job, and just knowing where to apply them is our intent here. So jobs theory is, am I buying a shovel? And, in the cases, that's really not the job of the shovel. The shovel is the buyer is thinking, I need a hole. Okay. So I'm not buying a shovel. I'm buying something to create a hole. And in turn, they need a hole because they are building a fence. So the approach here is I need a shovel. I need a hole that's 2 feet deep by 1 foot diameter that dictates the type of the shovel. And then I ultimately need to replace a 100-foot section of fence. So that's really the job of the shovel, is to dig a hole for a particular job. So that's the whole idea of jobs theory, is why is someone using a particular part of a product or service here. So that's the overall background of jobs theory. One of the authors is Clayton Christensen. He's since passed, but you can see a good video of his. He talks about a milkshake, and they did a study for a particular fast food company that was trying to determine why they were selling milkshakes early in the morning. And it wasn't until they spoke to a lot of customers, and customers actually articulating what the job of the milkshake in the morning was actually something for someone driving that was easy for them to consume on their commute. So it was kind of a meal like a smoothie, but that was the job of the milkshake, was to satisfy someone's daily commute. The free stuff that you can read is Tony Olwick stuff, Jobs to be Done. He's got a nice book about that, and he has a template, which I'm going to show you next. And then when Coffee and Kale Compete, they also talk about jobs theory. So at a high level, that's the folks at Tony's company, Stratagen, he has a template here. And so most jobs can be written up on the sheet of paper. And most jobs have some kind of steps from defining the job. You go through and locating what are all the things I need to do my job, preparing for something, confirming that it works, executing it, monitoring it, modifying it, concluding it. And you're trying to define what are the customer's outcomes and where are you overserving them or underserving them. We talked about that last week around the customer's hierarchy of needs to make sure you're not overserving. What are the minimum things that you need? That's on that path that we showed. What do they not care about? And where are areas that are underserved? And you might define them as consumption jobs. That's the top left corner, but just a real nice, simple framework that you can use to describe the jobs to be done. So as a product manager designing a software as a service, this is a typical format you would want your product managers to use to make sure you understand how is the customer performing a particular activity, but what are all the other things your customer is using, whether it's a B2C or a B2B world. So let me pause there. Have any of you used this kind of approach with the design of your product, your digital product? No show of
No.
hands there.
No volunteers.
All right. So a lot of product managers, are subject matter experts and they just assume this stuff. But if you are not familiar with the subject matter, the domain, this is a good way for a product manager to learn the industry very quickly and to understand and be in the shoes of a subject matter expert. Sharma, you have a question?
No, I was just going to comment. I guess we operate, given that we cater to both consumers and partners, our requirements predominantly are driven by partners. So we work very closely. So, overserve, underserve, it doesn't come into picture that much. But I guess we are more solving for what somebody's desiring rather than trying to proactively figure things out and see if we are overserving or underserving. So.
Yeah. Are you describing the end customer? You said you have
Yeah,
do I understand it's partners? So you're trying to understand their job to be done. Is that correct? Or the partners are
correct.
They're kind of your product managers in a way. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So you may have multiple jobs to be done, in that case. And this is where this can lead to event storming also, that those are separate jobs, and it's very helpful to understand one particular persona's job to be done versus another persona's job to be done. And there may be multiple jobs to be done within your product line. So again, it's a handy tool to have, but this is jobs theory or jobs to be done theory. It's pretty synonymous with this approach. Christopher, you said you've done some research on it. Does this follow what you had researched, or was there some different approaches you had seen?
There was, this is a bit more elaborate than some of my stuff that I researched. A lot of it was like writing jobs to be done, like the format and how you break that down. I did not come upon this canvas that you shared, which would have been nice.
And yours is probably just sufficient. This was designed for someone serving lots of industries, trying to teach it to a lot of folks. And so it's a simple framework to make sure you don't miss anything, and just to have a kind of a consistent way of communicating the jobs to be done. So, all right. So that's jobs to be done. So personas are really the person that's buying something. And so that we can think of constituents versus personas, and we're going to define these two separately. And a lot of you describe personas more as what I would call a constituent versus an actual persona. So constituents, and we'll get to the job and then the journey stages. So a constituent is what a lot of you claimed. Those are kind of roles or customer segments. So in this case, we're going to use the healthcare industry, and we're going to have quite a few different segments there. There's a claims administrator, there's your provider for healthcare, there's brokers and individuals. So in this phrasing, we're using the term constituent. A persona are an actual fictional person, kind of like a stereotype in a way. But the idea is you're thinking of a fictional person so that you're more likely to understand and empathize with that kind of person so you can anticipate how that might behave in different parts. So in this case, when you name these personas like Working Mother Mary versus California refugee Stacy, that's someone who's left California, moved to another state, single Terry or caregiver Kathy, just those terms are even more descriptive, say, of just the individual that's buying something. So it's a way to characterize a subsection of the market. You typically define these for people that are underserved, or you want to make sure you are serving a core part of your market. So that's the idea of these personas, and we're going to build this out a bit more. We talked about the job, and the job is what are the scenario that would cause those personas to want them to seek out your goods or service. So in this case, we're talking about healthcare. You switch jobs, you might need a different insurance. Smaller house, this would be more of a, say, a property insurance, not a health insurance. New child could lead to a combination of health and property insurance changes. So that would lead you to reach out to your current broker or a new broker. But those are the activities that you're looking for in the market. And then the journey stages are the plan or the typical path someone would take to consume your product. So in this case, you're registering for healthcare. You select a plan, maybe you have an HSA or a PPO. You get your ID card. You find a provider. All of these take time. They're sequenced. You might have a copay, and then ultimately you're going to have to negotiate and deal with the bill later. So these are all the journey stages that go on in this case. So just zeroing on the persona, it's a distinct person. So just kind of looking at them side by side. Constituents, a real group of people with similar title or role, typical, they have similar goals or objectives or formal influencers. The persona usually is a fictional person with personality traits, some demographic attributes, some tendencies, preferences, again, personality types that you're thinking for. And you would use them differently. A lot of times you only need constituent, but in some cases you need to go to the level of a persona. So in this case, use a different analogy. This is going to be a particular retailer to the trucking industry. And in this case, the constituent might be an owner operator versus in this case, a persona would be semi-retired Bob with ex-wife number 2 Sally. So the idea, this is a very specific persona that's also an owner operator of a group of trucks. You have the repair technician versus single Sam, a procurement administrator who's the buyer versus risk-averse Jim, a repair shop supply driver versus Tony Uber on the side. So just by comparing these folks, you can kind of picture very different personality types, very different tendencies. And so again, that's the idea of a constituent versus a persona. Usually the constituents are for customer segmentation, designing high-level content for a typical audience, or just navigating, if you know you've got to get some approvals of something's going on, there's other stakeholders involved. That's what the constituent is for. The persona is really trying to understand a very specific customer type that you're missing. It's really for the content and conversations. So if you have a sales force or you have a customer support team, a lot of the time the humans understand this. They know how to change their tone or language. But if you have a chat agent or if you have some content on your website, you want to make sure that content actually appeals well for these particular kinds of personas. And the real goal here is you're trying to identify friction in the relationship or anywhere you're missing a touch point or interaction that this kind of persona is not where we expect them to be. They're not going to visit our website or they're not going to call in. That's the idea of getting to a persona that where a constituent may not give you that information. So where it's also helpful is understanding who are the influencers and in a particular industry. So in this one, this is a different example of, this was a large structural engineering firm in the US. They were getting flat growth in their market, and they realized they were also losing a lot of bids, really competitive bids. And the typical buyer was being influenced by an architect, but ultimately the architect was being influenced by the developer. They were the ones really driving these engineering bids. And so by understanding who these different influencers were, you could understand not only the different constituents, but the different types of personas that interacted with them. You'll see this note on the bottom here, skip this for now, but the idea of the persona is understanding all the different influencers. How would a particular constituent influence one particular persona versus a different kind of one? So it's going to be helpful when we get to journey mapping a bit later here. All right, so the reason we talk about personas is if you just use kind of core demographic data, you may not really identify the same person. So we're going to do a quiz here. I think Eric has probably seen this one, so you don't get to answer this. But I'm going to give you some basic demographic data about this person. This is an individual. And so you'll need to identify who this individual is. And you'll want to, if you can, take yourself off mute. You can speak up as soon as you know who this person is. All right. So male, born in 1948, grew up in England, 2 children, 2 plus children. Okay, anybody, any ideas yet? You can start blurting out names. You may want to be off mute. Been married twice. Very successful in business. Any clues? Very wealthy, obviously. Kind of redundant with the first one. Spends the winter holidays in the Alps. No suggestions?
No guesses yet.
Owns a lot of real estate.
I don't know. It's like, I don't know. I'm thinking it's somebody from the royal family.
Isn't this guy the owner of
Okay, King Charles. King.
No,
I don't know what
the
their
owner
names
of
are.
Virgin? Oh, okay, sorry.
King, or is it King for whatever?
All
I'm
right,
just
but if
putting-
you, that's one answer, but you also could have had the Prince of Darkness.
Oh yeah.
So imagine same demographic attributes, but would you communicate or sell to these people the same way or talk to these people the same way? Very different, right? So that's the idea of understanding when you capture information about your customers, the more that you know about them, the more you can tailor this. So for a lot of your core products, this may not be important, but for selling your products or services to different folks, and this is just as important in the B2B world as is the B2C world, the more additional attributes you know about those personas, the more likely are you to win their business, keep their business, and retain their business. So that's the idea of capturing this. So typical persona would look like this. And I think you described this earlier, Christopher, but if you have the constituent name is the estate agent, Clive is the name. So you get a sense of, what the work context is, what their knowledge is, the channels they interact with, what are their typical motivation, wants, what are their goals, what opportunities do they have, what are their pain points. So again, the point here is this will help you in either your jobs to be done, which is the product you're trying to build, or perhaps how you sell to them or how you support them in the journey. So again, do any of you have personas like this today, either written down or at least in your head? Christopher, you have this level of detail? Is this kind of your description? You help people understand this?
Yeah, we have a couple of these for like the one that I've been talking about that we're trying to build with the. I would call them personas in this case, the way you describe them, not constituents necessarily, because they're fictional individuals based off of people that we do know, but I wouldn't say with all the fine detail at the bottom in here, but for the general sense of like who they are. Well, I guess we have like their motivations and wants in a different format, but yeah, something similar where it's like, that persona aspect of it.
And you built these yourself, right? You and your team, you didn't pay a
Yeah.
marketing firm. Yeah.
No, yeah,
And-
I guess we're super small, so I mean, like we don't
Well,
have anyone doing.
Even for big firms, we still recommend starting out by building this yourself. Yeah, so Stephen mentioned this. Stephen, you wanted to share how your user research teams, do they create these themselves? Can you tell me a bit more about how your team does this?
Yeah, so I'm not as close to this. So I didn't make the connection until I saw this example. I was like, oh, I have seen these before, and I should probably spend more time with them. But yeah, in our front end teams that focus on our front end design system, so they do spend time talking to customers and also looking at tracking the actual usage within the product, and they combine those two to come up with these kind of very fleshed out named personas.
how well do you think your team of engineers understands and embraces the personas?
Yeah. And so as I'm saying this, right, I realize not particularly
Yeah.
well. Like, yeah.
Well, the approach I found most effective is if you can take your team with your UX, and it's typically I would like the UX person to facilitate this, but have the UX team try to come up with one of these themselves with a fictional person, kind of like a role-playing game. And the reason when you do that, you have all of the team is trying to understand this character. And the more that, if you spend 20 to 30 minutes of the team building a character themselves, they're much more likely to embrace and understand and be in the shoes of that particular person. When an engineering team just reads one of these personas, I find that they really don't embrace it. They just kind of read it quickly, but they don't really internalize it and think about it. So, and then you could have the UX team go out and validate, are these personas accurate or are they not accurate? Or are they too small a segment? They're really not the right persona and to adjust it. But by going through the exercise of creating a persona as a team, we find that the engineers have a much better sense of what it's like to be in their shoes and understand their pain points. In addition to the jobs to be done, the jobs to be done really helps them understand what they're trying to do, but this understands other context, other competing interests that could influence them.
Sharma had his hand up.
Yep, Sharma,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
think you answered my question. When you said, hey, engineers don't necessarily embrace personas. I think it's the jobs to be done, right? I mean, what I found it useful is to really articulate the jobs to be done so that it allows them to be creative and not, they sometimes, when we talk about personas and how these personas behave, it feels like we are trying to somewhat semi-solution and give it to engineers versus if you say, hey, here's the job to be done, it allows them to be creative and come up with better solutions than I can think of. So I found that to be much more successful with engineers.
Absolutely. Yeah, jobs to be done is definitely the best for creating great solutions. And on the personas here, we find them more helpful when we get to the next one, which is the journey maps, which is when you have to be better at sales, better at customer support. But they're great tools. And the more that the engineers can take part in the jobs to be done creation or editing or review versus somebody else doing it for them, the more they're going to embrace and understand either the persona or the jobs to be done. And that's the main takeaway I want you to have from both of these is try to get your engineers involved at least 20 to 30 minutes of the exercise of doing at least one of these. Then you could have a UX team or someone else do more of these, but it really helps the teams understand if they've done at least one or two of these jobs to be done or personas to come up with better solutions. All right. The importance of personas. They help with really creating a compelling experience across all your touch points. Because when I mean by touch points, even if you're a digital first company, at some point you're dealing with humans in the buying experience. So it helps you with personalizing content or the tone of how you say things. Again, placement of where you would want to make sure the content exists, particular language like synonyms, and just making sure you're relevant. Your website's just the flow, the visual style we recognize from our website. It's really only appealing to someone our age and older. It looks a bit dated, as an example. It also helps with just usability and access to other information. Anything that you've got content-wise, again, humans or digital, that's where personas help, not just constituents. And then the overall experience of just when does someone want to interact with humans versus technology, what typical things would happen that help with loyalty, and then also helps how a particular persona would want to solve a problem. They may solve a problem differently than, for example, a different kind of persona that is a different personality type. So this is really where personas come more into play is your websites, your sales, your customer support, things that are typically outside of the core product. All right. So we're going to close out with journey maps. How many of you have done a journey map? I think by show of hands, I didn't see any before, or some of you done a journey map. Okay. Sharma, can you just quick
Actually,
update on where the
oh,
Yeah,
sorry, I was
go
like,
ahead.
oh, sorry.
we basically call it customer lifecycle journey from, onboarding all the way to, cancellation. What are the different touch points? What interaction we would like the customers to have or should have from a better product experience. So it's whether it's emails, whether it's, it's notifications, how we structure them and so on, how many, if should we kind of, provide it as a feed versus individual notifications. All these kind of factor in based on the touch points and some of the feedback that we get, but we call it customer lifecycle journey.
Yeah, very good. And then Christopher, you had a comment?
We actually, some of our clients, because like I said, we do the social media listing and the rare disease spaces. They've hired us using our technology to actually help them do journey mapping in terms of especially in rare disease, like path to diagnosis and stuff with that whole stuff there. So ironically, I haven't really done it for our own products, but we've done it for our other clients. So to help them with this process.
And that's totally supported. So you're an extension of them. You're helping them with
Yeah.
their journey maps. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've done a couple of them.
So we use the term relationship because the idea is that you're building a longer term relationship. That's what leads to, better win rates and ultimately higher retention and really better referrals. And that's where reputation comes from. And so the idea is you're trying to build a relationship with that. So, your constituents always have some experience, good or bad, which, over time can either build your reputation or if it, some point along the way, it can defer that and ultimately your reputation goes down, which leads to fewer win rates, which leads to higher churn. So good or bad, your customers will always have some kind of experience here. So to be successful long term, your customers need to really think, if not feel, that you care about them from the beginning all the way to the end of it, like a relationship. It's not just a life cycle, it's a relationship, because if you don't take care of it, it will go away. In some cases, you want to get rid of those, some customers you do not want to have a relationship with. You want to end that. So we've got one video that kind of articulates this pretty well. So we're going to play this quick video if you guys remember this one. All right. So thoughts? I know Eric's got thoughts on that one. Or is Eric too young for that video?
I'm not that young, Philip. Come on.
You just looked that young? All right. From others, where did the relationship go wrong? Let Kurt talking. Kurt, I haven't heard you talk yet.
I think it's just the way the car rental person was, interacting and essentially instead of trying to solve for the problem, you just provide something that the customer was not expecting.
Yeah, they weren't empowered, right?
Yeah.
To solve the problem. And also you get to a different component, different team. Somebody else was responsible for the reservation, right? And holding the car. So you put somebody else in a bad spot. So it's also behind the scenes, you can tell it's a system problem, right? It's systemic that they didn't have a way at this, to deal with this. Obviously, this was the idea is that, they did a real good job with the reservation, but they kind of lost it later on in the customer journey. So that's the approach there, is just making sure this has been fixed in the market generally since then. But all the different steps, particularly as you start building your products and you split into different teams, customers may traverse through different parts of your platform and different teams. And so you do want a product manager just seeing that overall journey throughout, whether it's in the core product or perhaps when they get to your website or later on. So the way that we formalize that is with a journey map. And so that's kind of the purpose of this, is to really get internal alignment among your teams between sales, marketing, customer support, e-com. This is very common in B2B, but also B2C, where you have these silos of teams because they're responsible for typically different parts of a customer journey. It helps close the gaps where you may be making a mistake either in a particular technology managed by a particular team or a particular human aspect. Ultimately, this helps you accelerate deals. It reduces friction. as people go through what are called the journey stages. And longer term, it helps to improve the reputation. So that's the idea of getting alignment across teams is really where journeys take place. And even if you're a very small company, you may drop the ball. If you're a small company of one or two, your customers are still going to interact with you at different touch points. They may hear about you from the website, search on you through Google, get a referral from someone else. And then there's from the moment they contact you, whether it's a phone call or an email or they hit your website, all the way through contract signature to onboarding and then support. Typically, those are different tools and technologies that you have. And as you start having different tools, your customers are going to span a lot of different tools or humans in your organization. So the idea is having a view from the customer view, as you said, the life cycle, but throughout the relationship. And we use the term relationship because it's the idea here. And we'll show you some different phrasing here. So when you talk to salespeople, you look at a Salesforce, for example, their concept is not really relationship, it's win the game. They want to win a deal. And so you have leads, they turn to opportunities that turn to wins, then you deliver the good, and then you support the customer. So that's what we mean in the sales context. In the relationship, let's say, and this is an example of dating, you first meet someone, you hang out, you get to know them, you start dating, and ultimately that leads to romance. So the idea is these are different stages and they take time, right? Whether it's a sales thing or a relationship, it's very hard to skip these stages. And that's why in the customer one, instead of using the sales terminology, we use these terms that are a little more relationship. So the first one is awareness. The customer is aware of the need for your goods or service. Then they're going to research you against others. They'll decide to purchase you over somebody else. And then they acquire your goods or service. This is also the onboarding. And ultimately, they're going to refer someone. And so that's why we like to use the term relationship, because it's more like the second row than it is the first row. If you think in terms of the first row, it seems very transactional, even though a good salesperson is thinking more in the term relationship. And we also use the term relationship because imagine when you're getting to know someone, you know more and more information about them, right? You have the right to ask more questions to capture more information about them. Same with your customers. You get to know more and more about them. You can't ask for everything up front. So you get asked for just the amount of information that you need to get the person from one stage to the next stage. Okay. So that's the idea of what we call it a relationship. And this could be not just for sales, it could be for recruiting. It could be as you're trying to raise money. You're going to go through these different stages and phases. And the point is there's a typical a set of time, and often there's different stakeholders involved as you go through this. So in your situation, the higher you are up in the company, the more you can influence this. If you're lower in your organization, you may be dependent on other teams that may own a stage in the journey before you or after you. So the journey concept is you are going somewhere and you're using different forms of transportation. So on the left side here, these are all very manual. The second one is more of, you have a car, you have more control. You go further to the right, and these are, you're still taking a journey, but you're not in as much control. So the idea is how much autonomy does the person have at different stages of the journey? So that's what we call it, a relationship and a journey map, because they are taking a journey through time, going through a relationship. So that's, again, the analogy of what this is. So looking at it visually, when you say a journey map, you have a particular job or scenario. We talked about the jobs to be done, and it's typically for a specific persona. And the stages are those different steps in the customer journey. You may name these differently in a different industry or market, or just by whatever function you're trying to serve. So using the sales analogy of purchasing a good, these are the same examples here. So these are the stages, and you're doing a persona analysis often against these different stages. So the persona is who influences them, how do they feel and think, what do they need, and what do they need to decide to it? What's going to cause them to go from one stage to the next? And that's where the persona analysis is helpful. It's also, we like to see teams do this because you get these different influences and perspectives to help people get from one stage to another, because it's very hard for one person on their own to do this. And then the touch points are humans and digital that are as people go through these. And these can be inside the company, they could be outside the company, outside of your control. They may be active, you're outbound, you're actively doing this, or passive, people may be coming in. So again, through the same stages, the catalysts are what's either the content or data that's needed to move someone from one stage to the next, and also what information are you allowed to capture from the customer at this point? Because the more information you capture with the customer, the better you can serve them long term, provide better services, upsell them, what have you. Again, all through the same stages. And lastly, the measurements are how do we know if we're successful? What works, what doesn't work? Where's the friction? And ultimately, where are you going to lose people in the funnel? So that's the idea of a journey map by having this more structured. So you typically do this in Excel or some tool like that, but we'll show you an example of what this looks like. And we're going to take two personas. And this example here is for financial services. This is someone looking for actually selling to an advertising for a bank in particular. And so when you look at these two different personas, you've got Jim, who's 28 years old, marketing specialist in a regional mid-sized bank, versus Frank, 53-year-old, who's in his history has been print media, and they just hired a newer, younger digital staff. And so they're looking for advertising services. So as you can imagine, each of those has very different goals, motivation, influences, questions they may have. Although they may all have the same goals, they may have different motivations. The touch points could be very different. You know, the younger Jim might start at Google, may then hit the website, then may do a research. In this case, it's for enterprise software. They're going to hit Gartner, and then they're going to be managed in customer, in CRM, and then a referral. So they may have very few human touch points, where Frank may call someone, may also do Google, a different Google search to research. They don't go to Gartner. They may call a partner such as an Accenture or some other ISV. And then again, it's all voice conversations, and they're interacting with someone else. So again, completely different touch points for the same product, in this case, enterprise software. So for each of those, it's going to be unique data and content that you would provide to them. And then you're going to have different metrics because it's different data and different aspects. So it looks kind of busy. You don't have to go to this level of detail, but the older the company that you have, the bigger the company, the bigger the market, the more often you need a tool like this just to get people on the same page. And it's often because you have different owners in the company that own different stages of the journey. Christopher, you have a question?
Yeah, does the persona analysis, I mean, does it always have to be a persona, or could you do this journey mapping with, say, constituents? Or it
You
doesn't
can
really
totally do it
apply?
with a constituent. Where the persona is helpful is sussing out the motivations and influences,
Mhm.
influencers or questions that someone has. If you think there's differences, if you think your constituents are all going to have the same motivations, have the same influencers, have the same questions, there's no need to go to that level of analysis.
And your distinction between, again, just so I'm following, the persona and constituent, the constituent's actually like a real individual that you
Yeah.
kind of interacted with? Okay.
Yeah. So in this case, these folks are still the same constituent. They're the
Yeah.
marketing buyer,
Yeah.
but they are a very different persona, right? Because they're going to research you differently. You know, if you're selling enterprise software,
Gotcha.
Jim's going to look at Gartner, and Frank is, because he's a print guy, doesn't even know what Gartner is. He comes from a print world. So in this case, it's more around the marketing and awareness and the research to get them to want to buy your software.
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah. So typically in the early stages of the buying process, the awareness is usually owned by marketing. They try to capture everything to increase inbound demand. Sales is trying to help someone from the research phase to the purchase phase. And so they're trying to do everything possible to close a sale, particularly when a human's needed, right? They don't want to step in when a particular person doesn't want to talk to a human, but they're trying to help them get from the research phase, because they're in the valuation, to the purchase phase stage. Once they've purchased, typically this is an operations team, and this could be fully automated at this point. So it's everything you need to just onboard it, to get the customer up and running with whatever good or service you have. And then you often have a support team that may be different from operations or part of operations, which is everything you need to keep the customer happy. A lot of times in companies of over, 20 people, definitely over 100 people, these are separate teams using separate tools. So product owners really need to understand the journey from end to end. A good product manager will understand the go-to-market function and the retention end to end. They won't just focus on the core product itself. If you're the CTO, you are responsible not only for your digital product or service, you're probably responsible for the website, any marketing technologies, any customer support technologies. So you as the CTO need to understand how these different pieces of technology fit together. And then HR and finance, they're involved along the way too, because they're helping hire people, retain people here. Finance is also trying to make sure that you're mitigating risk and collecting the money in an appropriate way. So those are more shared groups that have to look all the way across the customer journey. So that's why it's typically challenging to stitch all this together if you don't have someone focused on the customer throughout the life cycle and hence the relationship. So that's why you do the journey map, is just to make sure you're not dropping the ball somewhere along the way. Again, where to apply the techniques, jobs theory. This is really around having your product, making sure your product or service stays ahead of the competition. And it helps you kind of match and anticipate the customer's hierarchy of needs that we talked about last week. That's the jobs to be done. We talked about that the engineering team can come up with creative ways to understand what are they trying to do in their day-to-day job. And the personas, this is where you're role playing as a particular customer prospect. The more that engineers can role play, the more likely they are to better understand the user in the user story in the as a. And then the silver rule is kind of like the gold rule. The silver rule is treat customers as they wish to be treated if you were in their position. So it's not just in the same shoes, but if they're in a particular position, it really helps you understand what influence they have, what control they have, particularly in a complex buying decision or where you in B2B sales. And then lastly, journey analysis. This is really getting sales, marketing, product, customer support, operations on the same page. Your goal is to avoid friction in the funnel and to improve your overall sales and revenue. So that's the idea of these different techniques and tools. You may only use one of these, you may not use all three of these in your career, but that's the intent for all of these different tools. So before we go on to the schedule for our next topics, any questions about jobs theory, jobs to be done theory, personas, or journey analysis?
Chris,
Christopher, go. Yep.
Yeah, would you see, like, if you have like a kind of client services business area, would you see them who's interfacing with the clients, then doing a lot of this type of analysis or I guess research into that kind of job? Would you see like a client service department doing some of this type of stuff, who's really interacting with the customer? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Typically, if you want to create any self-help, when you design if you have a portal or a knowledge base or a ticketing system, that's where that team would do this analysis. And if they don't have those skills, this is where you might have a engineer or product manager help them do this analysis. So the product manager may just interview that team and just have them brain dump what they need. And so then they can sort it this way. It may be hard for the teams themselves, a customer success team, to do this work on their own. They probably need it facilitated by someone else doing this on their behalf.
Gotcha. And then can I bring another question? If you
Sure.
don't mind? Going back to like the personas, constituents, influencers, I guess so a lot of times when we're selling, some of the people that want to use the services, right, and that we're selling to are necessarily not the ones that, they need approval for the budget. So I guess the influencer would be their superior who they're trying to be like, hey,
Yes.
I want to use a service. And so like I have the constituents, in that case, the person who's actually going to approve their budget or their allocation of budget funds, that would be the influencer in this case.
Yes. And so in that case, you might need to create additional content. You might need to, for example, you might give them an ROI calculator or some way to help them articulate, to help them sell it internally.
Gotcha. Would it then, like, for the influencer, then would it be a good practice and to have a separate constituent?
You may need to.
Yeah.
You may, if it's needed, you may want to dig in and research that a bit more. And that one, you may need to pay for that. That may be harder for you to come up with. You may have to have your UX team, you ask questions, hey, describe this person, describe their role, describe
Yeah.
their job. Although the new LLMs can give you some good examples today, but
I'm sure.
a good salesperson is doing this, and they have a team and an army that helps
Yeah.
with this. And you might have marketing specialists that do this, but yeah, it's different content for those folks.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if you're in B2B enterprise software, you also have IT buyers, you have procurement buyers, you've got sometimes security folks, you have 4 or 5 different constituents you might need to have content for.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's what I'm after going through this. That's kind of like what I'm conceptualizing right now through
Yeah.
the materials.
And you don't have to get formal, it can just be talking points or notes,
Mhm.
just to walk people through it and do it as a training exercise. So
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil.
you bet. All right, so we're going to shift gears from product management into big data and machine learning. So the next 2 sessions are around traditional data and analytics. We have some fun stuff around what's called induction versus deduction and how that impacts the architecture. We'll talk about the movie Moneyball briefly and how it explains analytics for different audiences, like whether it's internal analytics or external things embedded in your product. And then the next one will be more on the architecture, some common best practices. And then we're planning 3 sessions on machine learning. The first 2 are around just some different techniques and models. And then the third one will be roles and governance. And then lastly, we'll get into transformations, which is how to influence others within the organization. And then event storming and domain-driven design, which is when you need to really split up a big architecture. So looking forward to having you guys in 2 weeks. And I hope you all have a good weekend. And we'll have these videos pretty soon. Doug's been cranking these out usually within 24 to 48 hours.
Fast as I can.
All right. Have a good
Thanks,
weekend,
Kate.
all.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Doug. Thanks for putting all the work in the videos, Doug. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Guys.
Have a great weekend, guys.